Hi everybody, it's Sue from the Marion Library, and March is Women's History Month. So we are going to talk about some of the great books that we have here at the library that celebrate women's history. And these are books that either by female authors or they are about women. So let's get started with our first slide. And we're going to talk about some historical fiction. The first book is The Uncharted Flight of Olivia West by Sarah Ackerman. And this is a relatively new book. It just came out in February. And it is a dual timeline book. It takes place in 1927 and 1987. And in 1927, Livy West is a young pilot, and she wants to participate in the Dole Air Race, which is from California to Hawaii. It's a 2,400-mile trek. And no one wants to hire her because she's a very young female pilot. She does persist, and she gets picked as a navigator. And she doesn't have a whole lot of skills as a navigator, but she's picked as a navigator for a male pilot and sets out on a dangerous journey. We also have 1987 and Wren Summers, who inherits a remote piece of land on the Big Island of Hawaii. She finds objects in the rundown barn that's on the property and decides to delve into the mystery of her late great aunt and the clues of a historic aviation mystery that's connected to the Dole Air Race. She befriends some residents from a local retirement community to help her solve the mystery because she figures they probably remember the Dole Air Race and maybe they can help her solve the mystery. So this novel is told through 2 points of view, the views of Livy and of Wren. The themes are taking on adventure, believing in yourself, and being a strong woman. This is a great book to read about Hawaii if you're interested in Hawaii and the culture, and also the Dole Air Race, which actually was something that did happen. Livy is a fictional character, but it's a really interesting story. So our next book is The Personal Librarian by Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray. And this, again, is historical fiction. This is really fascinating. This is about a librarian, and her name is Belle DaCosta Green, and she was J.P. Morgan's personal librarian. He had his own library in his mansion, and she was hired to curate his private collection. And unbeknownst to most of the people that knew her in this role as his personal librarian, she was keeping a secret. She was the daughter of the first Black graduate of Harvard, and she could pass for white. And when her mother moved her and her siblings to New York City, she decided to have them pass for white. So nobody knows that she is actually African American. It's 1920s New York City. It was very dangerous to keep that kind of a secret, especially in the upper echelons of New York high society, which is where she was at. She does befriend J.P. Morgan. They have a really great working relationship, and she becomes a very powerful person in the fields of art and rare books and in the upper class of New York City, all while she is keeping her secret. She's a very remarkable woman. She had to give up a lot in order to maintain her secret. And you can actually still visit the library, which is the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. Okay, our next book is The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. And this is a fairly new book as well. This is historical fiction. And this is kind of a mystery as well, and it is set in 1789 Maine in the small village of Hallowell. And Martha Ballard is the local midwife and healer. She's educated, she can read and write. She's probably in her, I'd say 50s in this novel. And the interesting thing about Martha Ballard is that she was an actual midwife and healer in the 1700s in Maine. And you can actually purchase the book that is her diary, where she recorded all of her births and all the things that were going on in town. It's a fascinating look into life in early Maine in the 1700s. But in this fictional mystery novel, She is the midwife in this town, and it's in the middle of winter, and someone is found in the frozen river, a man, and he's dead, and he is clearly a victim of murder. There's a lot of damage to his body. But who did it and why? So Martha, of course, as the educated medical person in this village, in this town, she looks at the body and she's like, oh, somebody murdered this guy. However, a male physician is traveling through, and he stops and he gives the opinion that no, this was an accident. This guy was not murdered. And of course, the judge takes the physician's opinion on this, completely ignoring Martha, even though Martha has all of these reasons why it was a murder. So the story is about Martha and her quest to uncover the truth. It's also an interesting story about the treatment of women during this time, the rights that women had in the courts of law in early America, and how Martha really had to fight in order for her voice to be heard. This is a great historical novel, and it will get you hooked right away, and you won't be able to put it down. So The Phoenix Crown is by Katie Quinn, and she's a super popular historical fiction author who writes a lot of novels set during World War II. And she also has a co-author this time, Janie Chang. And this novel is set in San Francisco in 1906, in the few days leading up to the Great Earthquake of 1906. And it is also set afterwards. It centers around 4 women who are connected to each other through friendship and circumstance. They all have a common enemy who is very underhanded, and you know from the get-go this guy is no good. It's a novel about female friendship, female community, love, revenge, and strength in a rapidly changing world. The 4 women are Gemma, who is an opera singer from New York City who has come out to San Francisco to be part of the chorus for one of the opera houses. Alice is a botanist who is this woman who, dresses in pants and is always kind of frazzled and is always completely obsessed with finding interesting plants wherever she goes. Nellie, who is an artist and a friend of Gemma's, and Su Ling, who is a young Chinese woman who has lost her parents. They owned a laundry in Chinatown and lost her parents, and her uncle has taken over the laundry service. And while it was once this really successful and great service, he's gambling all the money away and not caring about it. And he has told Su Ling that she has to marry this older physician in Chinatown, and she's only got a couple of days until that happens, and she does not want that to happen, so she's working to run away. So circumstances happen, the earthquake happens and brings all these women together, and it's a really interesting story. I started reading it and couldn't put it down. I really enjoyed it, and I'm always fascinated by the San Francisco earthquake, so it's a very interesting story. Quite enjoyed it. Okay, so our next slide features one of the books that is one of the most highly anticipated books of the spring, and it is, of course, The Women by Kristen Hanna, and she has a huge fan base, and most of her books are set around World War II. This is completely different because this is about Vietnam, the women who were nurses in Vietnam. And it is set in Vietnam and Coronado Island, California in the mid to late 1960s. And the main character is Frances. She's known as Frankie McGrath, and she comes from a wealthy family, and she just has one older brother who is sent to Vietnam very early, and she decides that she's going to join him as a nurse in the Army. The Army is the only one that will take her because while she graduated from nursing school, she doesn't have a whole lot of experience, but the Army is like, yep, we'll take you. So she ends up going over to Vietnam as an Army nurse, and is completely blown away by her experience there. She didn't know what to expect, and it is not at all what she expected. It's dirty, it's hot, it's humid, it's bloody, it's savage, it's everything that could have been her worst nightmare. But she grows into an incredible nurse as she meets other women stationed there, and she forms deep bonds with them. She forms deep bonds with Barb and Ethel, two other nurses that are on their first and second rotations through. She also falls in love a few times, but of course it always leads to heartache. And after 2 tours in Vietnam, she returns home expecting to be welcomed home by her parents and by her country. Instead, she faces hatred and rejection of a country that doesn't even believe that she was in Vietnam. She has PTSD, and she starts drowning her sorrows in booze and pills. And she's struggling to find happiness and love and to form a relationship with her mother and father, who feel like they're strangers to her. She also struggles to find help with the Veterans Administration, as they refuse to believe that women were in the front lines of action during Vietnam. These nurses were treated as people who didn't even exist over in Vietnam. The novel moves through the years of Vietnam through the early 1970s and finally ends with an emotional visit to Washington, D.C. in the early 80s. The main characters are Frankie, and Barb and Ethel are her friends that she meets in Vietnam, and they become lifelong friends. There's also Rai, who is one of her romantic interests, and it's a really good read. You will find yourself just kind of inhaling this book as you go. And of course, there's plenty of tearful and sad moments. And it's a really interesting take of war from a woman's point of view. So if you are a fan of Kristin Hannah, you're going to want to read this book. If you are a fan of historical fiction that is set in the 60s and 70s and also features Vietnam, then you're going to want to read The Women. So while we're traveling around the world, we're going to go to Paris next. And the Paris novel is by Ruth Reichl, who is a food reviewer, a very famous food reviewer. And normally she writes nonfiction, but this is her second novel. And this will be out in April. And this takes place in the 1980s and in Paris. And Stella is the main character. And Stella travels to Paris on her mother's last wish. Her mother has left her some money and a one-way ticket to Paris and said, you have to go to Paris and you can't come back until you've spent all this money. I think it's like $5,000, which doesn't sound like a lot now, but was a lot back in the early 80s. So Stella has some childhood trauma that leaves her really being very timid in Paris. She's not really enjoying Paris as you would. She's eating very simple meals. She's exploring a little, but not very much. She's living in kind of a sad little hotel. But on one of her walks, she sees a special dress in a vintage clothing store, and that sets her off on a life-changing adventure in Paris. So she meets Jules, who is a lovely young older gentleman who is an art collector, and he introduces her to so many people in the art, food, and book worlds that changes her life. Shakespeare and Company, the famous bookstore in Paris, plays a part in this novel, as well as a Manet paintings and a mystery behind the model of some of his paintings. In all of this, Stella discovers who she is, and some hidden talents come to light. This was a great story. If you love books about food and Paris, the food is amazing in this book. And it's a really good story about a woman who finds herself, finds her voice. And it's all because she meets people along the way who believe in her and kind of help guide her to find the best person that she is. Really enjoyed it. Okay, our next book is the complete opposite of the Paris novel, and this is called Murder Road by Simone St. James. And Simone St. James is one of my favorite authors. She writes really creepy, paranormally type thrillers, and this one takes place in Michigan in 1995. And April and Eddie are newly married, and they are driving to a little place for a honeymoon, and they take a wrong turn late one night, and they end up on what is called Murder Road, which is actually the Atticus Line Road, but it's known locally as the Murder Road. And they come upon a hitchhiker who is in desperate need of help, and they try and help her, and bad things happen. They end up as murder suspects for this hitchhiker who does not make it. They get her to the hospital, but she has been stabbed and she's dying. So they are under suspicion, and they have to stay in the town of Cold Lake Falls until they are cleared. And so while they're in Cold Lake Falls, they start kind of poking around because they both know something really strange happened on that road that night. And they realize through a little bit of investigating that the road is called Murder Road because there have been a lot of hitchhikers who have ended up murdered on this road, but no one has ever solved the murders. It's a really interesting book. There's some surprises. There's lots of secrets. There's secrets between April and Eddie and their backgrounds and where they come from. There's secrets in the town. The police know something but aren't telling everything. And it's a really interesting story. There are some moments that are really quite kind of creepy, but not in a graphic, horrible way. They're just really unsettling. And Simone St. James does a great job at making you kind of look over your shoulder when you're reading this book. So, Murder Road by Simone St. James. And our last fiction book is The Queen of Sugar Hill, and this is by Rashonda Tate. And this is a book about Hattie McDaniel, who was the first African-American woman to win an Oscar for supporting actress. She played Mammy in Gone with the Wind, and she won this Oscar in 1940. However, she was not welcome in Hollywood as anything but a small bit actress, even though she had immense talent. She supported herself, and she struggled with 4 bad husbands, segregation, and she ended up moving into the neighborhood of Sugar Hill, which was predominantly a white neighborhood. She was the first African American to do that. She also struggled with being accepted by white people and black people because some of the black people in the industry and in her communities felt that she had betrayed them by playing Mammy. And of course, white people just really didn't want anything to do with her. She did a lot in her lifetime, and it was interesting that she was really good friends with Clark Gable. Clark Gable would help her through some rough times, and he always stood up for her. She did die in 1952, so this takes place from the moment that she wins her Oscar up into the early 1950s. So if you like early Hollywood and you want to read a fictional account of Hattie McDaniel's adult life after she won her Oscar, The Queen of Sugar Hill will be a great book for you to read. Okay, so we're on to some nonfiction. And the first nonfiction book is A History of Women and 101 Objects by Annabelle Hirsch. And this is a fantastic book. It's pretty big and heavy, but it's a really fantastic book that looks at some of the objects that have shaped women's history. So each chapter is fairly short. They're usually 3 or 4 pages, and each features a specific object. And it begins with 30,000 BC and a healed femur and what that meant at that time, that there was a healed femur that they found, and how did that person break that limb and live long enough for it to be healed? Probably had someone taking care of them, and it probably was a female taking care of this person. We go all the way to the 21st century and the cell phone and how that has changed women's lives. Each object is about women's roles and their evolution in society, and sometimes some backward steps in society, and some are just about daily lives. Some of the items that are featured are pockets, corsets, thumb screws, bidets, something called a nun's crown, which is a really fascinating story, and a whole lot more. So this is a great nonfiction book that you can kind of thumb through, kind of go and pick here and there. There's tons of stuff through all the ages that you can read about, and it's one of those books that will give you enough information to pique your curiosity, and you'll want to go and do some more research and do a deep dive into some other things. So A History of Women in 101 Objects. Next book is The Grammar Girl by Hilarie Burton Morgan. You might know her as she's an actress, and this is her second book. And this is a part memoir and kind of a part of magical how-to book. And it's a book to read when you're looking for a bit of magic in your life, looking into your life and collecting bits and pieces to create memories, lifelong learning. There's simple spells in here, and also thinking about the legacy that you want to leave behind when your time is done. She really weaves a lot of her past memories of different places that she's worked and growing up, and she even talks about the old house that she used to live in as a child and all of the people that she's encountered along the way, and how a lot of the lessons that she learned from these people come back in years later to change how maybe she thinks about something or does something. And it's a really interesting little book that is a good read that will make you think about your life and kind of how you want to live it and how you can create moments of magic. Okay, so we've got a couple more books. So the next book is The In-Between. This is Unforgettable Encounters During Life's Final Moments by Hadley Vlahos. And Hadley is, she has a TikTok account, and she's actually pretty popular on TikTok. She is a palliative care and hospice nurse. She lives in Florida, and she recounts memorable patients that she's cared for at the end of their lives and how their lessons impacted her life. Anyone who's interested in hospice care or going through something similar will find these stories touching and informative. Hadley's got a great writing voice, and her stories are very touching and emotional, so you might want to have a hanky, but they're also really interesting about all the different things that people think about towards the end of their life and what they want to be remembered for and what they felt was important. So it's a really interesting book. So our final book is Why We Read by Shannon Reed. Subtitle is On Bookworms, Libraries, and Just One More Page Before Lights Out. And Shannon Reed has worked as a teacher for most of her life. Teaching literature and writing has given her many opportunities to discuss reading, novels, and classics with students of all ages. She's also learned a bit about her reading habits and love of reading along the way. This book is made up of essays the author has written about her love of books, reading, and her experiences as a teacher. She's continuously surprised at the connections novels make in a world where reading is often dismissed as boring. And I listened to the audiobook on this, and I quite enjoyed it. The book itself is made up of essays, so you can just read one essay, put it down, and go back to it later and pick up again. But it really is interesting to listen to her stories about her obsession with reading, and when she was younger, how all she cared about was, getting her reading count up there and just reading as fast as she could. And she realized that as an adult, that really wasn't the great way to appreciate the books that she was reading. She talks about reading classics and how it's okay if you don't read classics, and it's okay if you go back and read them as an adult. And there's always something to discover, and we all have our likes and dislikes. We all read at different speeds. We all prefer a different way to read. Some of us like audiobooks, some of us like ebooks, some of us like to have a book in our hands. It's all relative to the person that's reading, and it's a really interesting book that celebrates all the ways that we love books and reading and how important it is to us. So that is all I have for Women's History Month, and we will be having future book talks. Spring into Summer is coming on Tuesday, April 30th at 6 p.m. and then I will present that again on Wednesday, May 1st at noon at the Marion Public Library, where I'll be talking about some of the newer books that are out for the spring and early summer. So hope to see you then. Thank you.